In the brutal, unforgiving winter of 1939, two armies met in the remote wilderness of central Finland. On one side, you had the Soviet Red Army. Tens of thousands of soldiers, tanks, and a fearsome artillery train, all part of one of the largest military machines on the planet. Their orders were simple: slice Finland in half and bring the tiny nation to its knees. On the other side, a handful of Finnish border guards, hunters, and lumberjacks on skis, armed with little more than bolt-action rifles, a few machine guns, and a profound understanding of the frozen hell they called home. By all logic, what happened next should have been impossible. The Finns should have been crushed, wiped from the map in a matter of hours. Instead, they would orchestrate one of the most stunning and complete destructions of an army in modern warfare. This isn't just a story of an underdog victory. It's a story of how a few thousand men embraced the cruelty of their environment, turning the forest and the frost into their most powerful weapons. It's the story of how they systematically dismantled two entire Soviet divisions, piece by agonizing piece. This is the story of the Battle of Suomussalmi and the icy graveyard of the Raate road. On paper, the mismatch was almost a joke. At the very start of the engagement, as few as 800 Finnish troops were in the area to halt the advance of a Soviet force that would ultimately involve two full divisions. The Soviets had tanks. The Finns had almost no anti-tank guns. The Soviets had massive artillery batteries. The Finns had a handful of mortars. The Soviets were so confident of a quick victory that they reportedly brought a brass band with them for the victory parade in the city of Oulu. That parade never happened. The story goes that the instruments were found later, abandoned in the snow, a silent testament to the disaster that awaited them. On November 30th, 1939, the world was plunging into darkness. With Poland already crushed by Germany and the Soviet Union, Joseph Stalin turned his eyes north to Finland. His official reason was flimsy. He claimed he needed to secure Leningrad from a future threat and demanded huge chunks of Finnish territory. When Finland refused to just hand over its sovereignty, the Red Army invaded. This was the start of the Winter War. The Soviet plan was ambitious and brutally direct. In the south, massive armies would hammer the main Finnish defensive position, the Mannerheim Line. But a second, equally critical attack was planned for the center of the country. Here, in the sparsely populated wilderness, the Soviet Ninth Army had a daring objective. They would drive west along primitive logging roads, capture the village of Suomussalmi, and push to the coastal city of Oulu. If they succeeded, they'd cut Finland in two at its narrowest point, severing the vital rail link to Sweden. It seemed like a formality. To get it done, the Soviets assigned two divisions, the 163rd Rifle Division and the 44th Rifle Division. The 163rd, with about 17,000 men, would lead the charge. The 44th, another force of around 14,000, would follow to exploit the breakthrough. These weren't poorly equipped conscripts. The 44th, known as the Kievskaya Division, was a decorated unit, fresh from the invasion of Poland. Together, these two divisions represented a massive invading force. The Soviet commanders looked at their maps and saw a clear path. What they failed to see was the land itself. They saw lines representing roads, but they didn't comprehend that these were narrow, twisting tunnels cut through an endless, suffocating forest, hemmed in by frozen lakes and impassable swamps. And they utterly failed to appreciate the third combatant in this war: the winter. The winter of 1939 to 1940 was brutally severe, with temperatures plunging to a soul-crushing minus 40 degrees Celsius, a cold so profound it could freeze metal to bare skin. The Red Army, expecting a quick fight, was catastrophically unprepared. Their soldiers wore standard olive-brown uniforms, making them perfect targets against the snow. Their vehicles weren't winterized, their fuel froze, and their men lacked the skis needed to move even a few feet off the road. They were a modern, road-bound army, and in this frozen wilderness, that was their fatal weakness. Awaiting this red tide was a force that couldn't have been more different. Initially, the entire sector was defended by a single, hastily assembled unit, Special Battalion 15, made up of just a few companies of border guards. These were not professional soldiers in the typical sense. They were local men, farmers, loggers, and hunters who had spent their lives navigating these very forests. They understood the terrain not as an obstacle, but as an ally. They could move through the dense woods on skis with a speed and silence that was almost supernatural. As the reality of the invasion became clear, reinforcements were rushed in. The core of the Finnish defense would form around the 9th Division, commanded by a man who would become a legend, Colonel Hjalmar Siilasvuo. Siilasvuo was a 47-year-old reservist and a veteran of the First World War. He was a quiet man, but he possessed a brilliant tactical mind and an intuitive grasp of the unique opportunities this environment offered. He knew his forces, which eventually grew to about 11,000 men, could never win a conventional, head-on battle. They lacked the numbers and the heavy weapons. But they had something far more valuable: mobility. Clad in white snow camouflage, they could glide through the forest like phantoms, striking from unexpected directions and vanishing. While the Soviets were chained to their miles-long columns, the Finns could go anywhere. Their supply lines weren't lumbering trucks, but small sleds pulled by men or reindeer. And they were fueled by an incredible spirit of resilience the Finns call sisu, a unique blend of courage, grit, and stubborn defiance in the face of impossible odds. They were defending their homes, and they would make the invader pay for every inch of frozen soil. This asymmetrical advantage would become the cornerstone of Siilasvuo's entire strategy. On December 7th, after brushing aside the initial border guards, the Soviet 163rd Division rumbled into the village of Suomussalmi. The Finns, following a scorched earth policy, had already burned the village to the ground, denying the Soviets any shelter. Still, the Soviets had their first objective. The commander, General Andrei Zelentsov, settled his troops in, strung out in a long, vulnerable line along the roads. Complacency began to set in. They had met little resistance and figured the Finns were broken and fleeing. This was exactly what Colonel Siilasvuo was waiting for. Arriving on the scene, he immediately saw the opportunity. The Soviet division wasn't a cohesive force, it was a serpent, its head in the village and its body stretching for miles back along two narrow roads. Siilasvuo's plan was audacious. He wouldn't try to push them back. He would cut them off, surround them, and let the forest and the cold do the real work. Starting on December 11th, small, mobile Finnish ski units began a series of daring raids. They didn't hit the main Soviet force head-on. Instead, they sliced through the forest and struck the roads, the division's lifelines. First, they cut the Raate road to the south, blocking the main supply route. A few days later, they severed the northern route as well. Suddenly, the Soviet 163rd Division was trapped. General Zelentsov, who just days before felt victorious, was now completely isolated deep in enemy territory, with dwindling supplies and no way out. His men were surrounded not by an army, but by ghosts in the snow who appeared, caused havoc, and vanished. Panic began to creep in. What the Finns were doing had a name: Motti tactics. The word Motti is a forestry term for a cord of cut firewood, stacked up to be dealt with later. In military terms, it was a strategy of methodical destruction, perfectly suited for the terrain. It was a three-phase process: fix, isolate, and annihilate. First, fix. The goal was to stop the enemy column cold. A small team of Finns on skis, armed with machine guns and explosives, would find a vulnerable point: a bridge, a narrow causeway, or a sharp bend. They'd set an ambush, destroying the lead and rear vehicles of a section of the column, instantly creating a traffic jam that could stretch for miles. The Soviets, unable to move forward or backward and unable to deploy into the deep snow, were now fixed in place. Second, isolate. Once a part of the column was trapped, the real work began. Finnish ski troops would encircle the pocket, not with a solid trench line, but with a fluid perimeter. They cut communication wires and conducted psychological warfare, using snipers to pick off anyone who strayed from the road. One captured Soviet colonel later reportedly claimed that he never saw a single living Finnish soldier during the battle. He just knew that any man who left the road would never return. Most critically, the Finns targeted the Soviet field kitchens. In the -40-degree cold, hot food was essential for survival. By destroying the kitchens, the Finns condemned the trapped soldiers to a diet of frozen bread and plummeting morale. Third, annihilate. This was the final brutal phase. The Finns rarely assaulted a large Motti directly. Why waste lives when the winter was their most effective killer? They let the trapped Soviets freeze, starve, and waste their ammunition on phantoms. Hit-and-run raids continued day and night. Only when a Motti was weakened by hunger, cold, and despair would the Finns move in for the final assault, concentrating their forces to overwhelm the demoralized defenders. Then, they'd move on to the next one. It was a cold, calculated, and terrifyingly effective assembly line of destruction. While the 163rd Division was being dismantled around Suomussalmi, the Soviet High Command dispatched the elite 44th Rifle Division to the rescue. Commanded by General Alexei Vinogradov, this division was powerful, with over 14,000 men, dozens of tanks, and a massive supply train. On paper, they were more than a match for Silasvuo's scattered forces. Confident, they marched west along the narrow Raate road, heading directly for the besieged 163rd Division. They were marching straight into the deadliest trap of the war. Silasvuo, even while engaged with the 163rd, dispatched small units to deal with the new threat. He couldn't afford to split his main force, so he implemented an economy of force mission. In some cases, a blocking force of just a few hundred Finns was reportedly enough to halt the advance of the entire division. The Finns felled trees, laid mines, and used their few anti-tank weapons with deadly precision, creating roadblocks that the Soviet armor couldn't bypass. The mighty 44th Division ground to a halt. Its column, stretching for nearly 20 miles, became a static frozen serpent of steel and men. Now, Silasvuo could unleash the full fury of his Motti tactics. Having largely dealt with the remnants of the 163rd Division by late December, many of whom tried to flee across the frozen lakes, only to be hunted down or freeze, he shifted his main forces. On January 5, 1940, the main Finnish assault on the Raate Road began. Finnish ski troops, moving unseen through the forests, struck the column at multiple points at once. They blew up bridges, ambushed supply convoys, and used captured Soviet anti-tank guns against their former owners. Within hours, the 44th Division stopped being an army. It was now just a series of disconnected, isolated pockets, a chain of Mottis, each one a sealed tomb of confused and terrified soldiers. The Finnish strategy was a masterclass in turning an enemy's strength into a crippling weakness. The Soviet dependence on roads and heavy gear made them predictable and immobile, perfect prey for the fluid, ghost-like tactics of the Finns. This focus on ingenious strategy is a hallmark of so many incredible underdog stories. If you're fascinated by this kind of tactical thinking, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell icon, because we have many more stories of brilliant military minds and impossible victories coming up. For the thousands of Soviet soldiers trapped on the Raate Road, life became a waking nightmare. The temperature, which rarely rose above -30 Celsius, was a relentless enemy. Engines froze solid. Wounds that might have been treatable became death sentences as medical supplies froze. Frostbite was rampant. Many soldiers simply froze to death in their foxholes, sometimes found in huddled groups, frozen solid. Hunger was a constant torment. With the field kitchens gone, men were forced to subsist on hard, frozen bread. Some killed their own emaciated horses for food. Ammunition ran low. morale evaporated, replaced by a primal fear. The psychological toll was immense. The Finns were everywhere and nowhere at once. A lone sniper's shot would ring out, and a comrade would fall. A sudden burst of machine gun fire would tear through their ranks, then vanish. Patrols sent into the woods simply disappeared. A Ukrainian veteran of the battle, Sergeant Pyotr Morozov, is said to have later recalled the sheer terror and confusion, the feeling of being hunted by an invisible enemy. The Finns, by contrast, were perfectly adapted. Their ski troops would conduct raids, then retire to warm dugouts for hot food and rest. They even had mobile saunas brought near the front to maintain their health and morale. It was a level of winter warfare the Soviets simply could not counter. The desperate Soviets made several attempts to break out. Armored attacks were launched against the Finnish roadblocks, but they were suicidal. The Finns, using mines and concentrated fire, repelled every attempt, leaving the road littered with the burning hulks of Soviet tanks. By January 6th, the Finns tightened the noose, systematically reducing the Mottis one by one. Finally, on January 7th, General Vinogradov gave the order he had delayed for far too long: retreat. It was every man for himself. But there was nowhere to run. Thousands of Soviet soldiers abandoned their equipment and tried to flee north, but most were hunted down by Finnish patrols or succumbed to the extreme cold. The Battle of the Raate Road was over. The Finns captured a staggering amount of equipment, with estimates suggesting around 43 tanks, 70 artillery pieces, nearly 300 trucks, and thousands of rifles. This captured material was a godsend for the poorly equipped Finnish army. The road itself was a horrific monument to the battle, a frozen tableau of shattered vehicles, dead horses, and the bodies of thousands of Soviet soldiers. The casualty figures tell the story of one of the most lopsided victories in modern warfare. Across the entire Suomussalmi campaign, Finnish losses are estimated at around 800 men killed and some 1,200 wounded. Soviet losses were catastrophic, with estimates of the total killed, wounded, or captured often cited as being upwards of 23,000 men. For the Soviet Union, the defeat was a profound humiliation. The blame had to fall somewhere. The commander of the 44th Division, General Vinogradov, and his chief of staff managed to escape. But they didn't escape Stalin's wrath. They were immediately arrested, court-martialed, and publicly executed by firing squad. One of the specific charges leveled against Vinogradov was reportedly the irrevocable loss of 55 field kitchens, a grim acknowledgement of how critical that part of the Finnish strategy had been. The Soviet Union tried to bury the story. For decades, the fate of the 44th Division went unmentioned in Soviet histories. It has also been alleged that many of the Soviet prisoners of war who survived were treated as traitors upon their return home after the war, facing imprisonment or worse by their own government's secret police. So, how did this happen? How could a few thousand part-time soldiers on skis so completely humiliate two divisions of the Red Army? The victory at Suomussalmi was a perfect storm of Finnish brilliance and Soviet folly. First was Finnish mobility and adaptation. The Finns didn't just fight in the winter, they weaponized it. Skis, sleds, and white camouflage gave them a decisive advantage that completely negated the Soviets' numerical superiority. Second was the ingenious application of Motti tactics. Colonel Silasvuo and his men understood they didn't need to defeat the whole Soviet force at once. They just needed to chop it into bite-sized pieces and let the environment do the rest. Third was leadership and morale. The Finnish soldiers were fighting to defend their homes. Their sisu was sky high. Their commanders, like Silasvuo, were flexible and innovative. On the other side, the Soviet failure was absolute. Their leadership was rigid and arrogant. They catastrophically underestimated their opponent and failed to understand the terrain and climate. Their reliance on roads and heavy machines, a strength in Central Europe, became a fatal liability in the Finnish forests. The victory at Suomussalmi sent shockwaves around the world. It was a desperately needed boost for Finnish morale and a symbol of Finnish courage and resilience. While Finland would ultimately be forced by overwhelming Soviet numbers to sign a harsh peace treaty in March 1940, battles like Suomussalmi were crucial. They inflicted such staggering and humiliating losses on the Red Army that Stalin was forced to abandon his initial goal of conquering the entire country. Finland lost territory, but it kept its independence. The battle also had consequences for World War II. Watching from Berlin, Adolf Hitler saw the Red Army's poor performance, and it reinforced his belief that the Soviet Union was a colossus with feet of clay. This perception contributed to his fateful decision to launch Operation Barbarossa in 1941. The ghosts of the Raate Road would, in a way, haunt the Eastern Front for years to come. Today, the Suomussalmi battlefield is quiet. A stark memorial stands there, featuring thousands of stones for the fallen soldiers. It's a solemn reminder of the brutal conflict and of the incredible moment when a handful of men on skis, powered by sisu, faced impossible odds in a frozen forest and achieved one of the greatest military victories of all time. The Battle of Suomussalmi is a timeless story of how intelligence, adaptation, and courage can overcome brute force. If you found this piece of history as compelling as we do, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel for more deep dives into the greatest battles and strategies ever conceived. Let us know in the comments what other underdog victories you'd like to see us cover. Thanks for watching.